Hello everyone, welcome back once again to my channel where we are discussing about life process, the chapter of biology in class 10. In my previous videos, we have discussed about certain life processes such as nutrition as well as transportation. And in this video, we are going to discuss about the life process that is called as respiration. To start with the definition of respiration, respiration is basically the process of acquiring oxygen from outside and then breaking down the food sources to acquire energy for the cellular needs. So if we look at the definition, we see there are two basic parts in the definition. One is it is the process of acquiring oxygen. Okay, that's basically the first part of the respiration. And the second part is the breakdown of food sources to acquire energy. Okay, so that is why based on this we say that the respiration has two parts. One is called as external respiration, other is called as the internal respiration. So external respiration is the main process during which the exchange of gases, that is oxygen and carbon dioxide, take place, which essentially in human beings we call it as breathing. However, internal respiration is also called as a cellular respiration because this process is happening inside the cell. During this process, some chemical reactions are involved to extract the energy from the various sources of energy. In digestion, we have seen how various carbohydrates can be digested to form glucose. Now, from this glucose, we need to get the energy which can be utilized for various chemical reactions, that is stored in the form of ATP. So that process is called as your cellular respiration or internal respiration. So if we look at the processes of internal respiration, there are two basic processes. In one, oxygen is required, in the other, oxygen is not required. So if the oxygen is utilized in the process of respiration, we can call it as aerobic respiration. So here it takes place in the presence of oxygen, and usually more amount of energy is generated compared to anaerobic respiration, which is also known as fermentation. And here oxygen is not required, but the amount of energy produced in this case is quite less. Certain yeast cells and various other organisms, like there are certain bacteria and all, who carry out anaerobic respiration. Higher organisms like human beings and all, they carry out always aerobic respiration. So understand, this is the basic difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Now we will look at the process of internal respiration step by step. The first step in the internal respiration is called as glycolysis. The word glycolysis is broken down into two words. One is glyco, which means glucose, and the other is called as a lysis. Lysis means breakdown, glyco means the glucose. So in this process, basically the glucose is broken down to release some amount of energy. This process always takes place in the cytoplasm of a cell, and when the glucose breaks down, it gives you a molecule known as pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon molecule. Glucose contains 6 carbon in it. If you recall the molecular formula of glucose, it was C6H12O6. So there are 6 carbon in one molecule of glucose. But in case of pyruvate, there are only 3 carbon molecules, 3 carbon atoms in one molecule of pyruvate. Therefore, when one glucose breaks down it gives 2 molecules of pyruvate. It's very important to remember. Plus some amount of energy is also liberated. Now, whether aerobic or anaerobic respiration, this process is a common step that takes place. Then coming to the next step, where there can be 3 possibilities. If we are talking about aerobic respiration, then in the presence of oxygen, that same pyruvate is broken down in mitochondria of the cell to give carbon dioxide plus water, and a lot more energy is released. So all this energy, along with the energy that was produced in the previous step, that is glucose breakdown to pyruvate, also release some energy, and this pyruvate breakdown to carbon dioxide and water also release some energy. this energy can be trapped to form 38 molecules of ATP. So the ATP is known as the energy currency. Please understand this. ATP is known as the energy currency. So all this energy which is produced, it is trapped by the ATP molecule. So the amount of energy that is produced, that can be overall trapped by 38 molecules of ATP. However, if there is lack of oxygen, means oxygen is present in very less quantity, mostly in human beings, if we see someone who is doing a very strenuous exercise, but the oxygen availability in body is reduced, mostly in muscle cells it happens, then the cells can shift from aerobic to anaerobic respiration mode, where without any oxygen, they can start producing what is called as lactic acid. But some amount of energy is released here also. However, the amount of energy is very less, and only 2 molecules of ATP can be generated from that amount of energy. Do you recall, in the previous step, in the presence of oxygen, the energy that was generated was 38 molecules of ATP. Here only 2 molecules, right? So through this anaerobic process, which is also called as fermentation, since lactic acid is generated, we call it as lactic acid fermentation. So through lactic acid fermentation, very less amount of energy is generated. Now this lactic acid, when it will concentrate inside the muscle cell, it increases in concentration, then it often leads to what we very commonly encounter, that's called as muscle cramps. Fine. And how do you treat it immediately then? You do some amount of slow exercises, fine. You do some massage so that the oxygen flow is regained, and thus the cells will again shift from anaerobic to aerobic mode of respiration. Then in the complete absence of oxygen, if there is no oxygen at all present for the organisms which carry out anaerobic respiration, then those pyruvate molecules can be broken down to give ethanol, which is a kind of alcohol, and along with that carbon dioxide is produced, and again some amount of energy is produced. But same like previous step, amount of energy generated here is only around 2 molecules of ATP. So this is the process where the ethanol, which is a kind of alcohol, is produced. So we often call it as alcoholic fermentation. And remember, it is this process of alcoholic fermentation which is commonly observed in various day-to-day activities, like when you make curd, then the bacteria carry out this fermentation process and produce some amount of carbon dioxide, okay, and also some amount of acid is produced, fine. That was as discussed in the previous step. But in this step, you can see how the various alcoholic beverages are produced. There also carbon dioxide along with alcohol is produced, fine. So these are all the processes wherein the fermentation process is widely observed, fine. Now this entire process, in this entire process there is ATP molecule which are generated. So this ATP actually stores energy, or we call it as energy currency. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and when you break it down, then the energy is released. So energy that is obtained by carrying out respiration is stored in the ATP molecule, and whenever for any process energy is necessary, this ATP is broken down, correct? If you break down the ATP, then it becomes ADP, okay, and inorganic phosphate, fine. Similarly, ATP is produced also by joining of ADP and inorganic phosphate, fine. So when you break down 1 mole of ATP, 30.5 kilojoules of energy is released. That's a calculation you need to remember. 1 mole, however, be careful, not 1 molecule I am talking about. It's 1 mole of ATP you break down, you get 30.5 kilojoules of energy. So overall process of cellular respiration, which is already discussed in your book, is this one. I am just doing a revision of the whole process. The glucose in the cytoplasm is broken down to give pyruvate, which produces some amount of energy. Pyruvate can either undergo a complete process of oxidation in the presence of oxygen, and it gives you carbon dioxide and water. That is what is normally called as the aerobic respiration with release of energy. Then in the lack of oxygen, when the oxygen is present in less quantity, it will give you lactic acid plus energy, which was called as lactic acid fermentation. In the complete absence of oxygen, it can give you an alcohol known as ethanol along with carbon dioxide and some amount of energy production. So these two processes are normally called as the fermentation process, okay? And this one happens in case of aerobic respiration only. However, this entire process is a common process that is happening in both aerobic and as well as anaerobic respiration. So this is the overall process of cellular respiration. Now coming to external respiration, that is exchange of gases, how it takes place. In human beings, we have a specific system where breathing process takes place. But in plants, also this external respiration takes place. How? In plants, the plants can exchange with the environment directly through the special organ that's called as the stomata. Okay, and also the cells have large intercellular spaces. So through those intercellular space, the diffusion of gases take place directly into the cells. But here there are two processes, that is respiration and photosynthesis, happening at the same time, which need to ensure that whether oxygen will be released or carbon dioxide will be released. Because you see, respiration requires oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. However, photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. But at different period of time in the day, that is day period and night period, or daytime and night time, the rate of respiration and photosynthesis are different. So during night time, the photosynthesis rate is low. As a result, the less amount of carbon dioxide is taken in and less amount of oxygen is released. But more amount of oxygen is taken in, more amount of carbon dioxide is released, because respiration rate is comparatively high. So that's why we say at the night time you should not sleep under a tree, or in a closed room you should not keep any plants while you are sleeping at night, because those plants are also respiring at a high rate and will compete with you for oxygen availability. Okay, so the carbon dioxide release is a major gaseous exchange activity happening at the night time. However, during daytime, carbon dioxide absorption is high because the rate of photosynthesis is very high compared to respiration. Okay, so amount of oxygen released is very high due to photosynthesis, but comparatively low rate of respiration means less amount of oxygen is taken in. So major gaseous exchange activity during daytime is release of oxygen. Please understand these two processes, how breathing takes place in case of plants. Then in case of aquatic animals, among animals, there is a difference in the process of external respiration in case of aquatic animals and in case of larger animals like mammals. One thing we know, that aquatic animals like fishes and all, they have a specialized organ known as gills, which they use for the respiration. Now they take in dissolved oxygen from the water directly. In the gills there is exchange happening. But important to note is that amount of dissolved oxygen in water is much lesser compared to amount of oxygen in the air. So the concentration of water, oxygen in the water is less. If you see in an aquarium, the fishes, if you observe carefully, you will see their mouth is continuously moving. Literally, they are drinking water regularly. And if you see their operculum, which in normal layman language we call as ears, they are not ears, that is, they are covering of the gills on the two sides. Those coverings are regularly moving. So water is actually entering through the mouth and coming out through those operculum, okay, through those gill openings. So in the process, in the gills, the exchange of gases is taking place. So this process of taking in water and throwing out water is very fast, means they have a faster rate of respiration. So what is the justification for a faster rate of respiration in aquatic organisms compared to terrestrial organisms? The clear-cut justification is that the amount of oxygen dissolved in water is much lesser compared to amount of oxygen in the air which is available for the terrestrial organisms. Now coming to external respiration in human beings, which is essentially known as the process of breathing. So we have a dedicated system in our body that's called as a respiratory system, having specialized organs. If we look at these different specialized organs which are involved in the process of respiration, we start with the organ known as nose. I mean, everyone knows it, that it is a opening through which the air enters, through the nasal opening called as nostril. However, our nasal passage has some hairs which will filter the air, and the larger dust particles, etc., if anything is present, is filtered. Then through that nasal cavity, it directly reaches an area which is known as pharynx. In the pharynx region, again, it's a common cavity for the buccal cavity as well as nasal cavity, which joins here in the pharynx region. From the pharynx region, it will enter through a tube which is called as trachea. Okay, but in the beginning of the trachea, we get, if we see this one, this is esophagus on one side, and this is the trachea. Okay, I'll enlarge picture. This one is trachea here, this one is esophagus here. So what happens here is, since both have a common opening, so there is a flap called as epiglottis. Okay, this opening is called as a glottis, which is a common opening for trachea and the esophagus, which is covered with epiglottis. So at any one point of time, since it's a common opening, this epiglottis ensures that food never enters through the trachea. Like we say, when you are talking, when you are eating, you should not be talking at the same time. Why do we say that? Because here you have the vocal cords, because here you have the voice box, that's known as the larynx. Larynx is the voice box. So the voice box will be present here, and here you have the vocal cords. Now if you have to talk, that is to produce a sound, air has to pass through these vocal cords, right? So for that, the epiglottis will open, allowing the air to pass through it. At that instant, if food enters through your trachea, then it can cause problem. And that is why it is ensured that at any time when the food is going through the esophagus, epiglottis keeps it closed, means the trachea is kept closed by the epiglottis. When we come to trachea, it is a muscular windpipe, and this muscular windpipe undergoes division to form two bronchi. These bronchi can be called as initially primary bronchi, which undergo further divisions to form secondary and then tertiary bronchi. And the last part is called as a bronchiole. Now it is important to remember that throughout this trachea and bronchi, there are some internal rings of cartilage present. These rings of cartilage are responsible for keeping the windpipe stable when there is no air present inside. We say that it prevents the collapsing of the pipe. So in any pipe, you might have seen those water hose pipes. When the water is not present inside, the pipe will not remain like that in the cylindrical form. It will collapse, fine, or it will close down. So that collapsing is prevented here because internally there are some rings present inside the tube. These rings are called as rings of cartilage because they are made up of cartilage. Then, like in this diagram, you can see I have shown here this bluish part is a ring of cartilage. This is the esophagus, which is running along with this tracheal tube. So within this tracheal tube, this bluish part is the ring of cartilage. Clear? Then coming to the bronchioles end with a bag-like structure which is called as an alveoli. Very important, these are the structures of alveoli. And you can see these alveoli are bag-like structures which is having lot of small lobules, and they are richly supplied with these blood vessels. Okay, arteries and veins are forming lot of capillaries surrounding this alveoli. Now, why these capillaries are necessary, why they need to be richly supplied with capillaries, is because when we breathe in, then the air will enter through the nostril, the pharynx, and then get into the trachea. And from the trachea, bronchi, and all, it ultimately reach the alveoli. Beyond that, the gas has to be transported through the blood. So it is in the wall of the alveoli where the diffusion takes place. Oxygen from the inside the alveoli, it will get transferred to the blood in the surrounding blood capillaries. Similarly, carbon dioxide from the blood capillaries is getting transported into the alveoli, from where it will be thrown out in the process of breathe out mechanism. Then this entire alveoli, all the alveoli will be finally surrounded by the lungs, okay, which is a multi-lobed structure made up of spongy tissue and is covered by double membranous layer. The layer of membrane surrounding the entire lung is called as the pleura, inside which, if you see inside those lungs, you will see a lot of alveoli are present. Now, the entire lung, it's a very vital organ. So we have a safety measure for the lung. The safety measure is nothing but some bony cage. This bony cage is called as a rib cage. On the back side, we have what we call as the vertebral column, and then in the front there is a bone called as a sternum. So here you have a vertebral column, here you have a sternum, and the ribs appear from the vertebral column to the sternum like this. The ribs are present. From the back it comes to the front to the sternum. So there are 12 pairs of such ribs which forms a closed cavity, okay, called as the rib cage. Now, between these ribs, if you see this diagram carefully, this is suppose one rib, this is another rib, and let us say this is one more rib. Between these ribs, enlarged diagram is this. You have some muscles. These muscles are called as intercostal muscle. Fine. You need to know these muscles. In the process of breathing, it will be required. Then in the lower part here, you will also find a membrane covering which is called as a diaphragm. Fine. So if we see the rib cage, in the back side you have the vertebral column, front the sternum, surrounding there is lot of rib bones, okay, and between the ribs there are muscles, and from the lower side there is a diaphragm. So together it becomes a closed cavity. Now, if we look at the mechanism of breathing, how the breathing takes place, the two process, that is inspiration and expiration, inspiration or inhalation and expiration or exhalation. If you understand one process, the rest you will understand by yourself, very easy. You see, we start with what are called as intercostal muscles. There is the muscles between the rib cage. When the intercostal muscles are contracting, they contract, then the ribs and the sternum, everything will move upward and outward. Okay, it will move upward and outward. As a result, the entire rib cage inside, the volume will increase. Also, the diaphragm here will contract. The diaphragm normally, if you see in this diagram, it remains like this, a dome shaped, but here it becomes straightened. Fine. So when it is contracting, it becomes straightened, and that further increases the inner volume. So the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. So when the volume inside increases, the pressure inside the thoracic cavity will decrease. As a result, decrease means it will decrease the air pressure inside compared to the air pressure outside. So from outside, that is high pressure, to inside, that is the low pressure, the air will come in. That's called as an inspiration. In expiration, the opposite process takes place. That is, the intercostal muscles will relax. As a result, the ribs, which were upward and outward, will move inward and downward. Okay, that will reduce the thoracic cavity. Even the diaphragm, which was stretched, will again become dome shaped. So that again further decreases the inner thoracic cavity. Volume, it decreases. So inside, the air pressure now increased because the volume has decreased. Now compared to outside, now you have a greater air pressure inside. So from inside to outside, the air goes out, and that's called as your process of expiration. So that was a comparison between inspiration and expiration. Now, when we are regularly doing this breathing process, then when we expire or we do the expiration, then we expire out a large amount of air, but some small amount of air will always remain in the lungs, which at any cost you cannot throw out. How much ever pressure you give, that air you cannot throw out, which is known as the residual volume of air. Right? So it is defined as the minimum amount of air present in the lungs even after forced expiration. Now this volume of air you cannot exhale out. What is the function of this volume of air? This volume of air ensures that there is sufficient time for oxygen to be absorbed and carbon dioxide to be released. Right? And it also prevents the collapsing of the lungs during absence of air. Now this is understood that the lungs will not collapse because inside some amount of air at least is present. The first point you try to understand, if you exhale out entire amount of air, then when there is no air for a short period of time, then there will be no exchange happening between the lungs and the blood vessels. So there is some time required for this process of diffusion. So if you take in and throw out the air immediately, then there won't be enough time available for this exchange process. So that you get enough time for this process of exchange. So when you exhale out, some amount of air is still left inside. That is what we call as residual volume of air. Then coming to the respiratory pigment called as hemoglobin, we have discussed the air enters till the alveoli. From there it gets into the blood. In the blood, there is red blood cells, and red blood cells contain a pigment called as hemoglobin, which is red colored pigment. Now, in plants, etc., it is the diffusion by which the transportation of oxygen can take place to the different body tissues. Moreover, the living tissues are also less in number. But in human beings, first point, we are multicellular. There are a lot of cells, and all the cells are not in direct contact with the environment. So all the cells cannot carry out diffusion. Right? Moreover, the diffusion process is very, very slow process. So we use this hemoglobin present in the RBC to transport the oxygen. Right? So this red colored protein called as hemoglobin contain a iron pigment, okay, which is called as heme, that binds to the oxygen and carries the oxygen from the alveoli to the different body parts. And then the carbon dioxide, it is dissolved in the plasma and then carried by the blood itself. Carbon dioxide does bind to the hemoglobin, but its efficiency is very less. Its efficacy towards hemoglobin is very less. So very less amount, only just around 7% of the carbon dioxide can bind with the hemoglobin. Otherwise, it's entirely the oxygen which is binding more and more with the hemoglobin. So that was all about the transportation process in human beings, sorry, the respiration process in human beings and even in the plants, along with the entire cellular respiration we have discussed. Now coming to the hints to the in-text questions. Now there are advantages that the aquatic organisms have over the terrestrial organisms. So that is asked here. What are the different ways in which the glucose is oxidized to provide energy in various organisms? You have to speak about aerobic and anaerobic respiration in the presence and absence of oxygen. How is oxygen and carbon dioxide transported in human beings? Just now we spoke about that transportation process using the hemoglobin as well as plasma. How are lungs designed in human beings to maximize the area for exchange of gases? An important question. Here the alveoli are highly folded. If I go back to the diagram, these alveoli, you can see they are having many small lobes. So they are having lot of foldings. These foldings increases the surface area so that there is enough area for the exchange process. What are the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? The difference in terms of the products produced and the amount of energy evolved. with examples you have to explain. How are alveoli designed to maximize exchange of gases? That is again the same question as discussed before. What would be the consequence of deficiency of hemoglobin in our bodies? So think, if there is less amount of hemoglobin, there will be insufficient supply of energy or insufficient supply of oxygen. Correct? Some extra questions that we can think about is differentiate between external and internal respirations, the two types of fermentation, alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation differences, common steps of all types of cellular respiration, that's glycolysis, where does it take place, that is cytoplasm. What is the rate of energy released by ATP breakdown, that is 30.5 kilojoules per mole of ATP. How gaseous exchange activity in plants varies during day and night time, so that compensation between respiration and photosynthesis, that explanation. What is the function of rings of cartilage? Prevents the collapsing of the trachea. What is the residual volume of air? We discussed prevents collapsing of lungs and allows enough time for transportation of oxygen and gas, carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood. So these are some of the extra questions, and thus we finish another process of life process, that is respiration. Next video we will be discussing the other life processes. I hope you people have understood this topic. Thank you, students.